My dear brothers and sisters, those who came today expecting Sri Arun Vyasji to speak may be disappointed. Due to some unavoidable circumstances, he has not been able to come. So the instrument of the mother has changed. We are gradually inching towards that day for which we have been waiting now for at least 2 years, the 150th birth anniversary of Sri Aurobindo. And now it is just tomorrow. So that's something that you just heard in the first devotional song that me too offered. Shatak, the century we celebrated in 1972. And one of the things that happened in 1972 was that this road from Safdarjung tomb to Qutub Minar was named Sri Aurobindo Marg. And Chachaji, the founder of this ashram, with his characteristic sense of humor, often used to say कि मैंने कितने लाखों लोगों को श्री अरविंद के रास्ते पे चला दिया. उस शतक में अब अर्ध शतक और जुड़ गया है, as that musical offering said. And why we are excited about every अर्ध शतक being added like this is because we have been given the certitude that we are moving towards a new world, a new creation. That in fact is exactly the subject also of today's discussion. The title is, He Saw a World That Is from a World to Be. This is a line from Savitri. It occurs in Book 3, Canto 3. It is the 492nd line of this canto, and in my edition of Savitri, it is on page 330. He saw a world that is from a world to be. How the world is? It is fleeting, fragile and flimsy. Some have even called it a mere dream. That is something which so many spiritual masters have talked about. And not only talked about, they have realized it, they have visualized it and realized the ignorance and the falsehood that characterizes the manifestation on earth. That there is a heaven where the manifestation is there, but these imperfections don't exist, that also so many spiritual masters have realized. But Sri Aurobindo was unique in being the first spiritual master who visualized that the world may be fragile, fleeting, flimsy and so on and so forth, and it may be full of falsehood and ignorance, but that is not how it is always destined to be. The perfections of heaven can be brought down on earth. So this futuristic vision of the world is something characteristic of Sri Aurobindo, and that's what he says in this line. He saw a world that is as it is now, from a world to be, which means he saw the contrast between the world to be, the world of the future, and the world as it is. Before going further, for those of you who are not very familiar with Savitri, Savitri originally was a small legend within Mahabharata, and the legend goes something like this, that there was a king who had everything but. There's always a but in life. His but was he didn't have a child. So to get the child, he performed a yajna, and the result of that yajna and tapasya was that he was blessed with a daughter, Savitri, who was as beautiful as she was perfect in every other respect. And such people are easy to admire from a distance, but difficult to live with. And therefore, she could not find a mate. So her father told her, you go and look for a mate yourself. And she found in a forest Satyavan. And then came the foreknowledge from Narad that Satyavan will live for just 1 more year. But Savitri had made up her mind, and when that day on which Satyavan was to die was very close, she performed a Triratra ritual. For 3 nights kept standing on one foot And the result of this spiritual practice, of course, not just standing like that, but the spiritual orientation and the consciousness that went behind this gave her those powers by which, when Satyavan actually died, she could bring him back from Yama, the god of death. So that is the legend in Savitri in Mahabharata, the legend of Savitri in Mahabharata. Sri Aurobindo has given it an entirely different orientation. The king, Ashwapati, is here too. He also doesn't have a child, but then he is not performing his yoga for the sake of a child. He is interested in creating a new world. He wants the imperfections of the world to go. He wants heaven to be brought down on earth, and that is what his yoga is for. And he is finally given a boon by the Divine Mother that what you want will happen. Such a being will descend from heaven on earth as your daughter, and she is named Savitri. And then she gets married to Satyavan, as in the Mahabharata legend. Satyavan was to die after a year, but then she doesn't perform the Triratra Vrat. Instead, although she was already a spark of the divine, but on the outer surface she behaves like a human being, so she performs a year-long tapasya, and the result is that she acquires special spiritual powers. Then she accompanies Satyavan to the forest and pleads with the god of death that getting Satyavan back is important, because my mission is to change the world, and Satyavan is that ideal human material on whom I can work to usher in that new creation, and that is why both of us are important. This is the mission of my life, and Satyavan is the type of material on which I would like to work. So this is sort of roughly the type of plan in Sri Aurobindo's Savitri. And one of the longest sections in this is Ashwapati's yoga. Now this particular line comes in Book 3, Canto 3, which is towards the end of Ashwapati's yoga, and it comes towards the end of this canto, just a little before the canto in which Sri Aurobindo pleads with the Divine Mother for changing the character of this world, and he gets the promise that the boon that one shall descend from heaven who will do what you want. So that is the context behind this canto. So this comes towards the end of Ashwapati's yoga. By now, Ashwapati has realized the highest truths of existence. He was been through all the different types of worlds other than this world that exist. Some of those much worse than earth, and some of them somewhat like the earth, and some of them far better than the earth. That is what we call heaven. He has been through all these worlds. And then he develops a vision that the type of world that he has seen, which we call heaven, doesn't have to stay only in heaven. It can descend on earth. Now this is not just wishful thinking. It is not that he just got this idea from seeing that heaven. Why can't this earth be like that? It is a vision that this is something which will happen. That is the future of this earth. This earth is a unique planet, and human being a unique species on this earth, and it is this human being who has both the urge and the capacity to evolve further, who can collaborate with nature in taking the process of evolution further and eventually converting this earth into heaven. So it was this vision that he got, which was rather unique, and I'll give you a little glimpse of that vision from page 319 in my edition of Savitri. Transcended was the human formula, man's heart that had obscured the inviolable, assumed the mighty beating of a god's. Now this is Sri Aurobindo's realization, a part of sort of a few lines that sum up in a way the realization. Transcended was the human formula. He had transcended all human limitations. as a result of experiencing the highest truths of existence, man's heart that had obscured the inviolable assumed the mighty beating of a god's. So the ordinary man's heart, which has all the imperfection and impurity, that obscures the inviolable. The inviolable, the one that cannot be violated. And it's with a capital I. So it refers to the divine. The divine is inviolable. So normally this inviolable remains obscured by the ordinary human heart. But in Ashwapati's case, what had happened was it had assumed the mighty beating of a god's. Now it was not just an ordinary human heart anymore, it was beating the rhythm of the inviolable. His seeking mind seized in the truth that knows. His seeking mind, that is the intellect, the mental part of the being, ceased to be. It stopped functioning, it stopped working. Why? Because now it did not need that type of a crutch. Now it had access to the highest truth. Again, truth with a capital T here. His seeking mind, the mind just seeks, questions, gropes in darkness, and arrives at some little half-truths which we call facts. Sri Aurobindo call facts are the husks of truth. So that is what he arrives at with his mind. But that ceased to be. It was no longer necessary because Ashwapati had realized. And when I say Ashwapati, read Sri Aurobindo. I know all devotees are agreed on this, that actually he is describing his own yoga, and Savitri's yoga is nothing but the mother's yoga. So his seeking mind seized in the truth that knows. His life was a flow of the universal life. His life, that is the vital, was a flow of the universal life, the universal prana. He stood fulfilled on the world's highest line. So he had reached summit. But what was he doing from there? That is where the uniqueness of Sri Aurobindo's yoga comes in. Awaiting the ascent beyond the world, awaiting the descent the world to save. Now, waiting for two things. Awaiting means waiting for. Awaiting the ascent beyond the world. Having reached this realization, he was waiting for ascending to a level which goes beyond this world, and that many spiritual masters have tried to do in an attempt to many spiritual masters have attempted and advocated as an escape from the difficulties of this world. The world remain as it is, so escape to a higher world, that is the ascent. Awaiting the ascent beyond the world. But here, Ashwapati was not waiting just for that. He was also awaiting the descent the world to save. The descent from the higher spheres, from the supramental upper half of that consciousness, the upper half and the lower half. So the upper half is supramental and above, and the lower half is overmind and below. Overmind is sort of a bridge between the two. So he was awaiting the descent from this supramental. Why? The world to save. To save the world from all the ignorance and falsehood which had gripped it. So that is what. So he was waiting for both these things, the ascent beyond the world and descent into the world to save the world. So that is Sri Aurobindo's realization, summed up in a few words. Transcended was the human formula. Man's heart that had obscured the inviolable assumed the mighty beating of a god's. His seeking mind seized in the truth that knows. His life was a flow of the universal life. He stood fulfilled on the world's highest line, awaiting the ascent beyond the world, awaiting the descent the world to save. Then a few pages later, in page 323 in my book, Sri Aurobindo talks about the consequences of the descent of that heavenly supramental consciousness on earth. How will it change the world? Basically, human nature will change. Human nature depends upon the type of consciousness we have. So this descent of this consciousness will change human nature, and if human nature changes significantly for the better, the world will change. But let's listen to it in beautiful poetic language. a new and marvelous creation rose. So, the type of new creation with a significantly higher level of consciousness, which has now descended on earth and changed heaven into earth, that marvelous creation has actually been created. A new and marvelous creation rose. Incalculable outflowing infinitudes, laughing out an unmeasured happiness, lived their innumerable unity. So, what happened as a result of that? Incalculable outflowing infinitudes, laughing out an unmeasured happiness, lived their innumerable unity. So, this is sort of describes in a way the multitude, the large groups of people who have that type of consciousness, who now inhabit this earth. Incalculable. So, the number was very large. Outflowing infinitudes, laughing out an unmeasured happiness. Their joy was beyond any measurement, lived their innumerable unity. How did they live life here? In unity. And see the contrast or slight contradiction between innumerable and unity. How can it be many and also unity? That comes because of that level of consciousness. There is a sense of oneness, and therefore they lived their life living the unity, which in fact is a far deeper truth than the division and differences that apparently divide us. Incalculable outflowing infinitudes, laughing out an unmeasured happiness, lived their innumerable unity. Worlds where the being is unbound and wide, bodied unthinkably the egoless self. Rapture of beatific energies joined time to the timeless, poles of a single joy, white vasts were seen where all is wrapped in all. So, a further description of what that world, this new creation is like, where the being is unbound and wide. The individuals are not bound by their ordinary limitations. They have the width of the infinite, bodied unthinkably the egoless self. So there is a body, but then it is embodying an egoless self, self with a capital S. Rapture of beatific energies joined time to the timeless. So they are living in time yet joined to the timeless, poles of a single joy. White vasts were seen where all is wrapped in all. All, the divine is all, wrapped in all, that also is the all. Ishavasyam. He resides within all, nivas karte hain, and also Vasyam, the dress, he is the dress, the envelope around everything. It's both. Where vasts were seen, where all is wrapped in all. There were no contraries, no sundered parts. No contraries, no contradictions. How can there be a contradiction when there is only one? The one includes everything, and therefore there can be no opposition. Joy and sorrow, they are limitations, sort of the creations of the human mind. Joy and sorrow are both manifestations of the same. So there were no contraries, no sundered parts, no fractionation, because that Purna is there in everything. All by spiritual links were joined to all. That fundamental unity united all and bound indissolubly to the one, one with a capital O. So without any barrier, without any separation, they were all bound, connected, united in communion with the one divine. Each was unique but took all lives as his own, and following out these tones of the infinite, recognized in himself the universe. So, realizing that unity with that one, the divine, each individual recognized in himself the universe. He recognized that he is really, in a fundamental sense, no different from the universe. A splendid center of infinity's world pushed to its zenith's height, its last expanse, felt the divinity of its own self-bliss, repeated in its numberless other selves. So, in this type of a creation, the individual feels the divinity of its own self-bliss. That is, it is bliss itself. Its self, which is the same as the divine, is bliss because the divine is all bliss. There is no joy and sorrow. There is a bliss. Ananda, Satchidananda. Ananda is one of the attributes, and he feels that, and he finds it not only in himself but repeated in its numberless other selves. Other individuals, apparently others and therefore separate, but the same formula of the divine bliss has been repeated, duplicated in each one of them. That is what he can perceive. So this is the sort of fundamental oneness which leads to that change in human nature. And then a few lines later on the next page, none was apart, none lived for himself alone, each lived for God in him and God in all, each soulness inexpressibly held the whole. None was apart, nobody was really truly separate. None lived for himself alone, none lived for his own little individual self. Each lived for God in him, the divine, because that realization was there, that consciousness was there. So he lived for what he truly was, and God in all, and he saw the one who is with his true identity is also the true and fundamental identity of everybody else, and he lived for that God in him and God in all. Each soulness inexpressibly held the whole. Each soulness, S-O-L-E. So soul is a separate individual. So each soulness, each individuality, each apparently separate unit inexpressibly held the whole. Actually it held everything, the Purna. So the separation was only for form, for the outer form. So each soul, if one may say S-O-U-L, soul, each soul was soul, S-O-L-E, soul, and held the whole. Okay. Then it goes on. A few lines later, all struggle was turned to a sweet strife of love in the harmonized circle of a sure embrace. So all struggle, all the conflicts and kleshas, that we have in the world, they were turned to a sweet strife of love. There can be differences, but love dissolves all the opposition and bitterness of those differences. मतभेद होता है, मनभेद नहीं होता. In the harmonized circle of a sure embrace. So the embrace, which is full of that harmony characterized by unity, can dissolve all struggle into a sweet strife of love. Identity's reconciling happiness gave a rich security to difference. Identity being the same, fundamentally the same. Identity is reconciling happiness. So if we are one, then there is a happiness which reconciles this separation, this individuality. So identity's reconciling happiness gave a rich security to difference. So the differences were no longer threatening. This person is different, and therefore this person may be against me. So that sense of insecurity which comes because of we feel that somebody else is different and other, that disappears because of this identity. Identity's reconciling happiness gave a rich security to difference. So the differences were completely sort of wiped out, ironed out by the sense of security which comes from identity. Then another 2 pages later, on page 26, a few lines which talk about another type of aspect of this new creation. Each gave its parts to help as neighbors' parts, but suffered no diminution by the gift. Profiteers of a mystic interchange, they grew by what they took and what they gave. All others they felt as their own complements, one in the might and joy of multitude. So how did the individuals interact? Each gave its parts to help its neighbor's parts. So, love thy neighbor. So, the neighbor was helped with the powers that I have, and it goes without saying that the powers that the neighbor has are used for helping me. So, each gave its powers to help its neighbor's parts, but suffered no diminution by the gift. So, this is the type of giving that does not lead to any diminution, akshay, without any kshaya, but suffered no diminution by the gift, profiteers of a mystic interchange. This interchange is at a higher level, at the that mysterious spiritual level. They grew by what they took and what they gave. So they grew by both what they took and by what they gave. Giving love and receiving love are both opportunities for spiritual growth. And when this love is expressed by giving something, the one who gives grows, the one who receives also grows. The one who gives grows because he has looked beyond himself. The one who receives grows because he transcends his ego. Accepting something from somebody also needs ego transcendence. I am self-sufficient, I don't need anything from anybody. Now that also carries an ego. So when the person agrees to receive something which is given with love, that also is ego transcendence. So both the one who gives and the one who receives, they both gain from it. So they grew by what they took and what they gave. All others they felt as their own complements. They may not be identical on the surface, their forms may be different, but they are complementary. They fit sort of like a jigsaw puzzle to complete the whole. All others they felt, so I have certain powers, you have certain powers, so by give and take, we multiply our powers. So the result is that our strengths find a much wider outlet and our weaknesses don't matter. So all others they felt as their own complements, one in the might and joy of multitude. They felt that oneness in the might and joy of multitude, so that multiplicity did not in any way diminish the joy or the might or the strength or the capacities of the divine. It did not compromise them because of the interaction that they had with each other. Now this is an interaction which a present day master, we may call him, Gary Zukav, has called spiritual partnership. That is, in the world of the future, there will be spiritual partnerships which go a big step beyond ordinary friendship. Ordinary friendship is about, say, helping a friend out by whatever we can do for that friend, and once that is over, you just celebrate, now the problem is behind us. But what does a spiritual partner do? If the other partner has a problem, this person not only helps deal with the problem, but also provides the necessary stimulus how you can grow spiritually through this problem, because all problems and traumatic events are also opportunities. So it's even if he has not realized it, his spiritual partner helps him do it. So the spiritual partnership is about helping one another grow spiritually. So both grow through it. This is what we are seeing here. They grew by what they took and what they gave. So here Sri Aurobindo has talked about what we may call spiritual partnership. And then on the next page, another consequence of this type of change in consciousness. There was no gulf between the thought and fact. Ever they replied like bird to calling bird. The will obeyed the thought, the act the will. There was a harmony woven twixt soul and soul. This again is a very important consequence because it talks about the unification within the individual. All the different parts of the being are physical, vital and mental. The body, the emotional part of the being, and the intellect. They are often at war with each other. To reconcile them with each other, which is possible only if you reconcile them with the highest principle, that is the soul, is a unification of the individual. And when that unification has taken place or even is in the process of taking place, the person starts realizing that not only these different parts of the being within me, my body, mind and intellect, not only they are one with the divine essence, that is the soul, in all others also, the phenomenon is exactly the same. And therefore the person starts seeing a unity with all others. So unification of the individual with himself and unification with others around him. So it is this process of unification that these lines are talking about. Just see in how in 4 lines you have this entire process covered. There was no gulf between the thought and fact. That is what the ordinary mind is about. All that gulf disappears, it gets submerged in that higher and wider truth. There was no gulf between the thought and fact. Ever they replied like bird to calling bird. So thoughts and facts replied to each other as a bird calls to a bird. There's a perfect communication, and that perfect communication comes only when when thought is linked to the divine essence. There was no gulf between the thought and fact. Ever they replied like bird to calling bird. So this is unification of the intellect. The will obeyed the thought. The will, the execution through the prana, through the physical part of the being. The will obeyed the thought because the thought was linked to the divine and the body was linked to the divine. The will was linked to the divine. The will obeyed the thought. Again, a very important thing, because very often we know what is the right thing to do, but we can't pick up the courage or the will to do it. The gap between knowledge and practice, one of the most difficult and time-consuming processes in sadhana. Very early in our sadhana, for that matter, even a little child knows what is the right thing to do. So knowledge is not the problem. The problem is putting it into practice. And that gap between knowledge and practice is what, in a way, sadhana is all about. And a seemingly endless process, but every step as we take nearer being able to put into practice what we know, the more of joy and peace we get, things that we are looking for. But all the same, here in this new creation where that unification has taken place, the will obeyed the thought, the act, the will. So there's no gap between thinking and the will and the actual action. But then comes the second unification with the others. There was a harmony woven twixt, that is between soul and soul, S-O-U-L, soul. So between individual souls, there was a harmony woven. So there was a unification also with others. So unification of the individual, unification of different parts of the being with his own soul, and then unification of the individual with all others around him. All these are covered. Both these processes of unification are covered in just these 4 lines. There was no gulf between the thought and fact. Ever they replied like bird to calling bird. The will obeyed the thought, the act the will. There was a harmony woven twixt soul and soul. Now come to the page from which this line was picked up, that is page 330. As yet thought only some high spirit's dream or a vexed illusion in man's toiling mind, a new creation from the old shall arise. So here comes that assurance, that certitude that a new creation shall arise. As yet, so far, it might have been only a high spirit's dream, as yet thought only some high spirit's dream or a vexed illusion in man's toiling mind, or some sort of an illusion, something unrealistic created in the human mind, a toiling mind, a mind which has a tendency to work overtime and work hard. So in that mind it might have been an illusion. So far it might have been so, but now it will no longer be just that. A new creation from the old shall rise. That assurance is given. That will actually happen. As yet thought only some high spirit's dream or a vexed illusion in man's toiling mind, a new creation from the old shall rise. And what will happen in that? A knowledge inarticulate find speech. Knowledge with a capital K, which means the total knowledge. A knowledge inarticulate, the total knowledge cannot be expressed in words because it is infinite. Words are finite. But in this new creation, that infinite knowledge, although it is considered inarticulate, shall find speech, shall actually find the words to be expressed, as it does in the mantras which the rishis have heard during their peak spiritual experience, and then some of those mantras we have written down, and that is what we find in the Upanishadic and the Vedic mantras. So, in knowledge inarticulate find speech, beauty suppressed burst into paradise bloom, pleasure and pain dive into absolute bliss. So the beauty which was suppressed so far will burst, will find an outlet, as if it was just waiting for that trigger to puncture that balloon, and it will burst forth. Pleasure and pain dive into absolute bliss. Pleasure and pain, these opposites, will dive and lose their separate characteristic in absolute bliss. A tongueless oracle shall speak at last. The superconscient conscious grow on earth. The eternal's wonders join the dance of time. So again, further elaboration of the process of new creation. A tongueless oracle, the one who we feel doesn't speak, shall actually speak. The superconscient conscious grow on earth. So what is beyond our imagination at the level of mental consciousness, that superconscient, shall actually grow on earth. The eternal's wonders join the dance of time. So time itself will start expressing more clearly the wonders of the timeless, the eternal. But now all seemed a vainly seeming vast, upheld by a deluded energy to a spectator self-absorbed and mute. Careless of the unmeaning show he watched, regarding the bizarre procession pass like one who waits for an expected end. So now here is that seer's, Ashwapati's, Sri Aurobindo's vision, but still waiting for it, expecting it, very certain that it will happen, but still at the stage of waiting. But now all seemed a vainly seeming vast, upheld by a deluded energy. All seemed, rather vast, upheld by a deluded energy, an energy which does not seem to be well directed at this process, but only seems to be not well directed, to a spectator self-absorbed and mute. So the Rishi, Ashwapati, Sri Aurobindo, is seeing himself as a spectator, self-absorbed and mute, visualizing all this like a spectator, careless of the unmeaning show he watched. So he doesn't care much for the unmeaning show that he has watched, the show on this earth, and for that matter the rest of the realization, which is only about the ascent. He doesn't give much significance to that. Regarding the bizarre procession pass, all this is coming and passing, but why is he so oblivious of even such fascinating things that he has seen, like the ascent and so on? Because when you are waiting for something still better and different, then all this becomes a little insipid and does not hold that same type of attraction, and therefore like one who waits for an expected end. So he's expecting an end which is the descent rather than all that ascent which is for his personal realization and salvation. And then comes this line which forms the title: he saw a world that is from a world to be. So what was that end that he was expecting? A world which will be very different from the world as it is now. So it was still at the level of an expectation, and it will become a realization in the next canto, where the assurance is given that the Divine Mother shall descend in the form of Savitri. So what we have seen is that Sri Aurobindo was unique amongst spiritual masters in being the first one who was not satisfied with his own realization, who did not give up this world as something beyond redemption, who did not say that, well, this world has been created in a certain way, that is the character of the world, and therefore it cannot change. The Divine wanted the world to be a place like that, which will be full of all this ignorance and falsehood, and correspondingly, therefore, also all the inequalities, injustice, misery and suffering, and the way to get out of it is to escape into a heaven which also exists, but then for that one has to work on this earth, live a human life in such a way that we qualify for that type of an ascent. So that was the type of a picture which many spiritual masters had seen. And of course they had visualized also the heaven which does exist. But then the uniqueness of Sri Aurobindo is that he has seen the heaven being brought down on earth. And this is not just wishful thinking. It is not an illusion of a deluded mind, as is said in one of these lines. It is not even an extrapolation from the process of evolution. It's not a mental extrapolation. Because if you see evolution, you can say that, well, evolution from matter to life, life to mind, and from mind to the mind of a human being has followed a certain line, a trend in which more and more of the hidden divinity in different forms has been expressed, and man is the latest product, and therefore mentally, rationally, intellectually, it makes sense that the next step will be that this evolution will ensure that there will be another type of creature brought which will express even more of the divinity than the human being does. So this is an extrapolation. Sri Aurobindo is not talking about just visualizing it as wishful thinking, I wish all this suffering disappears. He is not talking about extrapolation at an intellectual level as I did just now. He is talking about a vision. He is talking about something that he has seen. He has seen it is a part of his realization. Just as seeing all those worlds which he saw while passing through the different worlds other than this one, just as he saw all those worlds, in the same way he has also seen very clearly the type of world that this planet will be. So it is neither wishful thinking nor extrapolation, it is a seeing, a realization. In that he was completely unique and unprecedented as a spiritual master. Now, many people still feel that we don't see it happening. That's because the ways of the divine are mysterious, difficult to understand, and therefore we may not be able to understand through what route, through what processes, through what path that will happen. There are people who feel that yes, the world has improved over the last few centuries, and some who have also started saying that it will change for the better. So what Sri Aurobindo said more than 100 years ago, many of the present day thinkers and masters have started saying, and what it indicates is that somehow in the atmosphere, so that many highly evolved souls are picking up that thing, that process which is happening. And this process does require, in fact, the participation of the multitude, and therefore these people are also making an important contribution, and each one of us can make an individual contribution from starting where we are and trying to use this life to take a few steps towards that higher consciousness. So each one of us can contribute. Some of the notable ones whose works I am a little familiar with are Gary Zukav, whom I have mentioned as the one who has talked about spiritual partnership, and the human being of the future, instead of calling that human being supramental, he is called that individual multisensory. He will not have just 5 senses, he will have additional senses. So he is called that multisensory being who is round the corner about to evolve. Then there is Nikki Kartre in Soul Power. He said spirituality will no longer be an individual pursuit, it will be collective and will lead to a collective upliftment of the human race. Then there is David Hawkins, who has quantified consciousness and has been able to see with his vision that during the relatively recent past, the consciousness has gone up more than it did in several centuries before that. So there has been an acceleration of the process in the recent past, and therefore he has also visualized a much brighter future. So there are these 3, and I'm sure there are many more who are talking about it, but to start with, at a time when it looked completely unbelievable, Sri Aurobindo was the first spiritual master to have not only this idea, but actually a vision, a realization, and based on this realization, he could give a certitude that yes, it will happen. So let me end with a few lines again from this same page. A new creation from the old shall rise. So this is an assurance, a certitude. A knowledge inarticulate finds speech, beauty suppressed burst forth into paradise bloom, pleasure and pain dive into absolute bliss.